And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Timnit Gebru.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I've been giving this talk lately about the hierarchy of knowledge in machine learning, what I call the hierarchy of knowledge and its consequences, because it feels like it's been at the root of a lot of issues I've been having. So I kind of wanted to just give a more general talk about that. I'm seeing. Oh, you can't hear.
No, I can hear you. That's not a problem. I believe
Oh,
I
okay.
can hear you.
Okay. Okay, cool. So last year at iClear 2020, the International Conference on Learning Representations, Ruha Benjamin gave a talk, and in her talk, she said that computational depth without historic or sociological depth is superficial learning as opposed to deep learning. And she gave a few she later expanded on that claim. And then later there was this conversation that I heard between Meredith Whittaker and Ruha Benjamin. It was on the radio that they where Ruha made this observation that we have so many coding camps, but because we assume that everybody needs to learn how to code, but we don't have, for instance, any social science boot camps for computer scientists. And this is true for me too, because I'm involved in a number of such initiatives. For instance, my colleague Jelani Nelson started an initiative called Addis Coder, which is a 1-month algorithms and coding boot camp for Ethiopian high school students in Addis Ababa. But I've never heard of, I've never heard of anybody saying, computer scientists need to have social science boot camps because this kind of knowledge is super important. So that's the kind of stuff I mean by the hierarchy of knowledge. I'm gonna see if I see something. I'm gonna ignore the chat most of the time, but I just want to see if, okay, yeah, nobody has an issue. Okay, good. I just wanted to check if anybody's having an issue hearing or something. So in my case, I grew up enjoying math and physics, partly because I don't know, nobody ever had applied pressure on me to enjoy those subjects, but I just liked them. And I saw them disjoint from whatever, social movements we're having in life, or war, or any of the other realities that I have experienced. My father was an electrical engineer, so I sort of, I think all of us, the kids, also just studied electrical engineering. And I also love dance. And I never sort of tried to connect these two things, but one time I was trying to figure out why did I learn how to dance much better? Or why did I feel like it was more effective the way I was learning how to dance versus some of the other things I was trying to learn in college, for instance. And I came across this article by Rachel Thomas, who is co-founder of Fast.ai with Jeremy Howard. And Fast.ai is basically a school for people to learn about neural networks and other parts of machine learning. And they have a lot of writings about pedagogy and how we teach people certain things. And so Rachel was talking about giving this example of Paul Lockhart, who's a Columbia math PhD, and how he quit from being a professor at Brown to teach K-12 education because he felt like the way we were teaching math was wrong. Because he gave the example of what if you weren't allowed to sing songs as a kid, or you didn't hear all these songs, and you had to learn all of the intricacies of musical notation before you were allowed to sing a song. He said, that's how we're teaching math right now. People have to get all the notation right or whatever before they could kind of have some sort of understanding of the big picture. And I felt like that was probably a good explanation of why I also, learned how to, I would say, enjoyed learning how to dance better than some of these other things I was learning. So growing up, I again, thought of any sort of social change as completely separate from my, some of these scientific disciplines that I was being taught. So when I was 15, I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and I'm of Eritrean descent. And Ethiopia and Eritrea had a war in 1998, and so we were people of Eritrean descent were either being deported or we had to leave. So that's when I had to leave, and I came to the States under political asylum as a refugee. And when all of that was happening, one of the things that was something I just kind of focused on when all of this other stuff was happening was my education, right? Like I said, math, physics, whatever, engineering, because I just never thought that it would be connected to whatever was happening to me. And I was taught to think that way. And not only that, but I felt a lot of pressure to separate out any sort of technical work I was doing from any sort of from society even. So I was an electrical engineer at Apple. I was a circuit designer. I studied analog circuit design. So I sort of tried to combine my interest in music with my interest in circuit design. And so on the left is like just a class that I took where the very first lab class I took, and I tried to create a piano key with, like one key with oscillators or something like that. On the right is like some testing stuff of analog to digital converters. So I was really interested in, for some reason, in A to D converters, analog to digital converters, and it had really nothing to do with their like what they're used for, but I just found them to be interesting. That was just it, from a signal processing perspective. And so I still have this book, and I was kind of going through it and while we were working on this stuff. But so later on, I learned about, how some of these modulation techniques came to be popular, right? A lot of it had to do with World War II, radar, decoding, etc. And this was just not something I learned in school at all, whether it is as an undergrad, whether it is, before that, I just didn't at all learn about the connection of war, some of the biggest wars that we've had, and Silicon Valley or other tech companies and schools, like very prestigious schools. So for instance, I did not learn about William Shockley. So I learned a lot about William Shockley, who and is credited with the invention of the transistor. And so I heard all sorts of anecdotes about, Hewitt and Packard, for instance, and how they, Terman, who was their professor, lent them money to create their first company, and how that was one of the seeds of Silicon Valley. And so when I was at Stanford was very proud of its role in creating Silicon Valley, and was, we were all innovators and like special, and that's the kind of ethos I was learning about. So I never learned about William Shockley and his eugenicist views. And so he's written a lot of eugenics. For instance, he talks about how, he talks about obviously how he thinks that Black people are inherently less intelligent and inferior. And in fact, he has concerns about this because he's concerned for the welfare of humanity. And as a person coming from the background that I'm coming from, and for everybody, this should be extremely relevant information. The only reason it wouldn't be relevant is if one thinks that someone's work in this area is completely separate from these views. And I believe that they're really not. And so recently, actually, just now, ACM just awarded its highest honor to Jeffrey Ullman, who has had extremely detrimental views to many groups of people. And now they weren't just views, they actually had, especially Iranians, people of Iranian descent. And he said lots of stuff about lots of people, like Native Americans, for instance. And a lot of Iranians have been talking about how first of all, many of them didn't even want to come. They just assumed that they wouldn't be able to come to Stanford. Stanford hadn't admitted an Iranian person for 10 years. And then once they went to school, they taught a lot of them, like for instance, my colleague Niloufar Salehi, who's a professor at Berkeley now, talked about how powerless she felt and how traumatizing it was to be at this school that this person was employed in. And so now he gets the highest award from ACM, right? Again, this is this assumption that all of this other stuff just not that important. It's all separate from whatever science or math or technology that you're working on. And in that vein, I again did not learn about how tech is the impact of tech institutions and academic labs in some of the most fundamental things that have happened in the world, and for me, some of the most life-changing things that have happened in the world. For instance, war. So this is one example. This is one article talking about how, in the US, a lot of schools are now sort of trying to reckon with their history of, slaves and slavery in general, how they used slave power, slave labor, and how they never acknowledged it, and how they contributed to this history. And so some schools are starting to come to terms with it. But this article is saying, like, in the same way that these schools are coming to terms with this past, they should also come to terms with their contributions to war. And so, like I said, the only thing I got really in this realm when I was at Stanford was that, the school's very proud of its role in innovation and Silicon Valley, and that it encourages the startup culture. And so this attitude that that this is there is a meritocracy, that science is objective truth, that it's not really dependent on your point of view or anyone's point of view, but that it's just this kind of objective thing that's out there has been critiqued by a lot of scholars, especially feminists and queer and Black scholars, and it's called the view from nowhere. And so here's one article about how to combat the view from nowhere, and how to teach science in the classroom such that we don't perpetuate this this attitude. And for me, in my point of view, this is a huge reason why we have some of the issues in ethics and justice and fairness that we have in machine learning. It's a huge reason, one of the biggest reasons for why I was fired, because my scholarships and my knowledge was not accepted, was kind of people were above me, were trying to suppress it, thinking that their view and their background didn't affect how they made this decision. So there are a number of people talking about how this seeps into our current way of thinking in terms of AI, for instance. This is an interview with Sabelo, that I highly recommend, and I highly recommend his writings and also writings by Ababa Barhane. They talk about how, for instance, the way ethics is imagined in the Western world versus, for instance, in various parts of the African world, how they manifest themselves in people's conception of AI. So this just one example is how Leibniz was, really thought that he was borrowing from people who thought that they could derive a symbolic language that would try to convert, Muslims to Christianity through reason. And so these points of view seep into what we're doing in various ways. So given all of this, given the juxtaposition between the fact that having this view from nowhere is harmful, but I never learned about it. I was taught that this, that science was, again, very separate from your background. I had a lot of pressure to kind of remove whatever I experienced or who I was from my work. So being a good engineer meant decoupling anything I experienced from my work. And caring about society was not really a good thing. You know, you have to be seen as quote unquote neutral, although there's no such thing as neutral. So when I was doing a PhD, I really resisted. I did not want to be seen as quote unquote an activist, even though that's something I had to do by necessity, given the experiences I was having. You know, you have to you have to do that to just exist, to just be able to do your job. Right now, a lot, and so of course later on, I just didn't, I didn't care. I don't care right now. I don't care if I'm considered an activist or not or whatever. But not that activism is a bad thing. I think it's a very necessary and very noble thing to do. But there is a way in which people use this term, which is not in the noble way that you might think. So, for instance, so yeah, after my talk at Caltech, I was giving a very different talk. Pietro Perna was trying to explain to me, a professor at Caltech was telling me that I was weaving in and out of science and activism. So I was weaving in and out of science and how I view the world should be. And I was trying to explain to him that these two things are very related and they're not separate. So how you view the world to be is very much influencing your science, even though you don't think that way, because maybe how you view the world should be is the default and the predominant view. So you don't feel like nobody's challenging your view. So you feel like you know, you're the objective one, but that's actually not true. Your point of view about the world is affecting your scientific process at every step of the way. So this term activist that's used to describe scientists. So Mahdi, who is a theoretical computer scientist. So he works mostly on robustness, but also works a lot on misinformation. By necessity, he was born and raised in Morocco, but he's currently a professor at École Polytechnique in France. So he was the last person we hired as 20% in our team before I got fired. So he was still, poor guy, was still in orientation when I got fired. So he talks about how the way people describe me as an activist rather than a scientist is very similar to how many scientists are looked at as not productive if they're engaged in public discourse. Even though in my view, that's one of the most important things that you should do as a scientist is engage in public discourse and disseminate the knowledge that you're creating in as many different forms as possible. I'll talk about that later. Because if you don't do that, it sort of assumes that the only people who are deserve to hear about your findings or are the people who read the papers in that form that you write. And so I think it's kind of this, you know, understanding that there are certain groups of people who come to these conferences who read these kinds of papers, and they're the ones who deserve to have access to this knowledge. Whereas if you are constantly engaged in disseminating this knowledge in many different ways, it can reach many different groups of people who might want to use your science in different ways. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But another thing that Mahdi talks about is how this description of scientists as activists reminds him of how authoritarian governments many times use this distinction to describe journalists. So when they want to target certain journalists, they will call them activists rather than journalists. So they're not calling them activists in this, you know, noble kind of great, you're an activist way. They're saying, oh, that so and so is an activist, so we can. Then it's sort of a laying the groundwork for then targeting them. So you're separating them from the other journalists that you're not targeting. So he gives a lot of examples of this in Morocco, for instance, because he used to be a journalist before he got his PhD in computer science, in math, I guess. Okay, so this is sort of on the one hand, right? Like public dissemination, you're considered, you know, not a scientist. The view from nowhere, because you're not supposed to bring, you know, your experiences to science, etc. And on the other hand, right now, a lot of people are talking about interdisciplinarity, how interdisciplinary work is good, how it's important to bring knowledge from other disciplines into machine learning, etc. So when I say other disciplines, like many times there is a hidden sort of understanding of what disciplines are considered at the top of the knowledge, the hierarchy of knowledge, so that therefore it's respected if you bring these ideas into machine learning. So physics-based models or ideas from game theory, for instance, like generative adversarial networks, etc. This is considered a good, rigorous technical sort of work. But what about ideas from history or critical race theory or anthropology? They are not really, if you bring ideas from these disciplines to machine learning, it's not really considered at the high end of the knowledge hierarchy. And, I would say that's because of the hierarchy of knowledge. And the hierarchy of knowledge basically is people at the top of the hierarchy sort of gatekeeping and saying, oh, this other type of knowledge is not really valued. And many times it's done by those in power. For instance, Mar Hicks is a tech historian and writes about, in Programmed Inequality, writes about how in Britain, like many other countries, most of the early computers were women. It was considered a women's job. It was advertised as such, etc. And as this discipline started giving people more power, it started becoming more lucrative with the advent of the personal computing, etc. And now all of a sudden it started shifting as being, not a woman's job. And so then the people in power were starting to gatekeep women out of this work. So like I said, gatekeeping is always done by those in power. So for instance, that's what happened to me with our paper on the dangers of stochastic pairs. This paper was written by 7 authors from many different backgrounds in all the things you can think of: disciplines, demographics, geography, etc. The two first co-authors were me and Emily Bender, who is a very celebrated linguist who has written like, some seminal textbooks. And she had won best theme paper at ACL with another paper. And I was very frustrated that the voices of people like her were not being heard in this debate about large language models. People were all talking about large language models. It was a thing. It was so hyped. It seemed like every company was like rushing to have larger and larger language models, but they weren't. Even when I heard criticisms, it wasn't from people who are in marginalized communities who would be most affected by these negative consequences of these large language models. So at the same time, at Google, a lot of people were asking, what can we do? What are the ethical considerations? So I thought, I told Emily, I said, hey, like a lot of people are asking me this. So do you have any papers? And she was like, no, but do you want to write one? And I said, okay. And we assembled our team and who had already been thinking about these things, and we wrote this paper. Once we wrote this paper, it was approved in a regular Google publication approval process, whatever. And at the last minute, apparently a bunch of people decided that this paper should not be published. And then later on, like Jeff Dean wrote this email to everybody, and one of which said that it was below the publication bar. And this is a very well-known playbook. So thankfully, from the MIT Media Lab, Caitlin, Danielle Wood, and Catherine Ignazio wrote, I should have put it here, the Misogyneer Playbook. And so they put what happened to me in context of what happened to Black women throughout history. So I'll give another example of this later. So this what happened to me is gatekeeping, and it's really not a very unique sort of thing that happens to people like me. And so in terms of the gatekeeping and the hierarchy of knowledge, there are a few examples. So there is movements, for instance, to decolonize history. So a lot of indigenous groups have the way history is passed down is through poetry or through oral history, etc. But in many disciplines, in many Western institutions, this is not considered like rigorous or real documentation. So there is a lot of movement to, so for instance, in South Africa, there is a movement to decolonize history. So given all of this, my work has usually been trying to bring ideas that are outside of my current discipline to my discipline, but usually not the idea, yeah. So that's sort of been most of what I do. And so one example is data sheets from electronics from when I was an analog circuit designer. And so this is work on data sheets for data sets. So we think that we have a workflow for people who are trying to annotate and gather and collect data sets. And also, we're trying to encourage documentation of data sets so that people think through what are the different characteristics of their data that they're and their process. And this comes from data sheets in electronics where, when I was designing a system, I always looked at the data sheets of each component that I was putting into my system, and I saw like a lot of testing that was done on standard operating characteristics. What happens when you change one aspect? What happens when you change another aspect? What should it be used for? What shouldn't be used for, etc. And a similar thing for model cards. This is similar type of work for models. Another example of this is interventionist data collection from archives. So it's really interesting. Recently, Thomas Padilla was saying, why are people in AI talking a lot about documentation, etc., but they completely ignore works from the library sciences? And so this is work from this is the opposite. This is drawing from work in the library sciences and archives. The first author here is Unso Jo, who is a historian at Stanford. I think she just graduated now with her PhD. But so, archives are the oldest, kind of the oldest discipline to gather human data. So they have a lot of methodologies. They have a lot of discourse on some of the issues that arise when you are working on annotating and gathering data sets. And so here is an example of like of the process they have. They start with a mission statement of what they want to do to the highest level agenda. So they go from a macro to a micro process. And so we were in this paper, we were talking about how we can take these lessons and apply them to machine learning. Excuse me. Another work is applying our understanding of race and gender and intersectionality to our work. So this was work by Joy Buolamwini, who I guess you got mentioned it earlier, showed it was part of her thesis that these gender recognition, or people call them like gender ascription, really tools, because they just ascribe a gender by looking at someone's face, and in this case a binary gender, and they're making a lot of assumptions. So this is one example of how you cannot assume that someone's worldview does not seep into the technology that they're building. Because in this particular API, what they do is they look at someone's face and it ascribes a gender, male or female. There's a lot of assumptions here that are baked in, that gender is binary, that gender can be determined from someone's face, that it doesn't change that much by culture, that it is kind of static across time and different cultures, etc. So this is a very good example of how the view from nowhere just does not apply. In that paradigm, if you guess, if you just do a coin toss, the accuracy would be 50%, like random chance. And so we see that the darker and darker the skin tone for women, these APIs were approaching random chance. And so this was from 2018. Things have changed a lot now. Another example is ideas from econ and organizational sociology. So this is a paper called Diversity and Inclusion Metrics. And actually, I'll paste this into the chat. We have what we call an explorable. So I was working on it before I got fired, but after I got fired, they released it. So we teamed up with a data visualization team called Pair to have, here, I just pasted it into the chat. So if you look at this, we have a lot of visualizations to describe some concepts in the paper and describe like some, just help people understand some of the choices you can make and how they affect your understanding of diversity and inclusion. And this paper is basically trying to understand how can we score when we're trying to select a subset from a larger set. So let's say image search or something like that. You have a number of things that are returned when you do image search. How do you score? How do you determine whether that like smaller set is diverse or inclusive, given how complicated these topics are? So I highly recommend for you to see the data visualizations. I think it's really cool and it helps people get a better understanding of the topics. So I want to talk about why, like, if any papers were effective, what made them effective. And so the first thing for me is to focus on the foundation. And the second thing is to focus on impact. So what do I mean by this? For instance, works like data sheets and model cards, they're not really fancy in the sense that we're talking about documentation and testing processes. And some people actually talked about, why they thought that people in the library sciences were completely ignored, or works in the library sciences were completely ignored in these categorization documentation practices when people talk about this, because that's a lot of the work that they've done. And a lot of people say there is a gender component to it, right? Again, the hierarchy of knowledge, this knowledge was considered towards the bottom rather than towards the top. So for model cards, for instance, we wrote this paper in 2019, but we've been working on it all the time since 2019 for 2 years or more. We were still working on it when we got fired, me and Meg Mitchell. Meg Mitchell especially, she worked on prototypes that could be released. And then for the prototypes, she had to gather and annotate data sets. She had to do all sorts of stuff. And she was working on this the whole time from a year or two. And then we wanted to figure out what the bottleneck was, if people wanted to create model cards, what kind of testing that they should do for different kinds of models, et cetera, et cetera. So we could have, if we weren't focusing on the foundation, we wouldn't have focused on documentation or processes. And if we weren't focused on impact, we would have just sort of moved to the next paper, going from one paper to another. And working with people who have domain expertise is key. And this is one type of knowledge that's usually ignored. And so at least in HCI, they have, value sensitive design, or they have methodologies that they call diverse voices methodology. Often when people work on a particular subject, they completely ignore, they might ignore domain expertise. So for instance, if you're working on something, some of these works that I mentioned earlier, like gender shades, like this, you can say that Joy Buolamwini had a huge domain expertise because she was inspired by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, gave examples of this. As a dark-skinned woman, she understands the difference between race and colorism. We both understood that race was an unstable social construct across space and time. But actually, when we wrote this paper and we submitted it, when the reviews came back, they weren't like, glowing reviews. It was a borderline paper that barely made it in. And people didn't really understand the significance of the contribution. Again, that's because this type of knowledge was not really considered at the top of the hierarchy. And then another thing that is, again, usually, I guess that's why people call me an activist, and it sort of is used in a manner that's not really, sorry, it's not like a praise, right? Collective movements are one of the most important things to make impact. So one example here is Deborah Raji, who got the 2020 EFF Pioneer Award with me and Joy. She was the first author of a follow-up paper called Actionable Auditing that her and Joy wrote. And one of the things this paper showed that was that Amazon's recognition tool could have similar biases to the ones that we described in Gender Shades. And that, Amazon should stop selling its recognition tool to law enforcement, which right now they had announced a 1-year moratorium. So when this paper came out, VP after VP attacked Deb and Joy's work. And it was, again, a similar playbook as the way they attacked my work. They tried to say that it was subpar technical work. They tried to say that it had errors. And me and my co-lead, Meg Mitchell, spent one whole year coming up with a rebuttal. And then we had an open letter that was signed by a lot of academics, especially those in computer vision. And they helped us edit it. And it was a point-by-point rebuttal, and then it was published. And so it was not possible for them to attack the work any further. But this is, again, part of the Misogyneer Playbook, where when you're a Black woman who is doing work to reduce the harms of these powerful corporations on your community, you are attacked in exactly the same way. So of course, a year or two later, same thing happened to me. And so that's one example of collective movement. Another example is Black in AI, which is an organization I co-founded with my colleague Redit Abebe, and there are a number of other people who were around early on too. And Deb told me that before she came to Black in AI, she was about to leave the tech industry as a whole. She was gonna exit because she had been very isolated. She had felt a lot of discrimination. She had faced a lot of sexism and racism, and she was going to leave. And then she found Black in AI. She found a community that was supportive of her and helped her stay. And we all knew each other through that. And then we were able to then support her in writing this letter and kind of amplify her voice. Without that, Deb might have not been in this field to create this kind of paper that put her at risk. And mind you, she was just an undergrad when she wrote this paper. And imagine a VP of a big company like Amazon attacking an undergrad like that. And then without this other collective movement that we had, again, they would have gotten away with the attack. Even though she stayed in the field, they would have gotten away with the attack against her work, but they couldn't. Another example is the Algorithmic Justice League that Joy Buolamwini founded. That is behind many of these works that I'm talking about, including the Gender Shades paper and the follow-up Actionable Auditing paper. So even though apparently many scientists engaged in public dissemination are considered less productive, this public dissemination is one of the most important ways to engage for scientists to disseminate their work. So with Gender Shades, one of the reasons that it's been so effective is because Joy used all possible avenues to disseminate her work. One of them was art. So she had a spoken word called AI Ain't I a Woman. She performed it in many different places. She had art exhibitions. There is this documentary that was created by Shalini Ananda, and now it's Coded Bias is being streamed everywhere on Netflix starting, I guess it was starting April 5th. So these are all different modes of communication. And in fact, on Coded Bias, you will see tenants of the Brooklyn apartments, and Trinae is one of the main people who was fighting against the installment of face surveillance in their apartments. And the way Trinae was able to fight is that she found the Gender Shades paper, and she was explaining to us actually how important it was that we had a website, and that Joy is the one who built this website with visualizations, and with bite-sized, easy to understand results and repercussions. So she didn't have to, so if people didn't read the paper, she could go to other community members and explain to them what the issues were and what the repercussions were using that website. And she said that was very, very helpful in their fight for to remove this surveillance system from their apartments. And that was very important to us because we want this paper to have some sort of impact. We don't want it to just be a conference paper and die there. There's many different examples like that. There's other court cases that I've seen. Well, I was actually subpoenaed for one where gender change was heavily referenced. And that was because, again, the results were disseminated in so many ways to reach so many different groups of people who could then use it to advance their causes. I'm not going to go through that. So all of the stuff that I said was said by apparently Carrie Wagstaff at ICML in 2012. This was a keynote that she gave. And so she talks about how there are so many components in machine learning to do machine learning that matters, that has impact. So many components, but for some reason in these conferences and journals in the academic community, what's considered the pinnacle is to choose or develop an algorithm and to choose metrics or conduct experiments. That's really it. And so I'm going to skip this, but and so why is this the pinnacle, right? Why is choosing or developing an algorithm or choosing metrics and conducting experiments the pinnacle? So people say this about me too. I haven't heard it most recently, but before they used to say, oh, but what has she really done in computer vision? Like, what is the algorithmic component of her work? And my question is, why is this algorithmic component the pinnacle? Why is that the way in which someone's impact is measured? And I honestly believe it is because of what I mentioned about the hierarchy of knowledge, where labor related to data is at the bottom, is devalued, and it's at the bottom of the hierarchy of knowledge. So this book by Mariel Gray and Siddhartha Suri talks about the ghost work. So all of the data annotators who are paid very minimal works, who don't have any job security, and how this field of AI that is requiring a lot of data annotation is creating a global underclass with this devalued labor. On the other hand, a lot of the issues that we're talking about with respect to bias, a lot of them have roots in data. So for instance, in the decisions of taxonomy and process that are used when people are creating data sets. So Ababa Berhane and Vinay Prabhu have this paper. This paper, Large Image Data Sets, a Pyrrhic Win for Computer Vision. Emily Denton and Alex Hanna, my former teammates, and Morgan Claus, who interned with us, have a lot of works. And for instance, Emily's talk, Critical Perspectives on Computer Vision, is very good for this. And I'm happy to see that now NeurIPS actually has a new track on data annotation and benchmarking that people can submit their work to, which is a step in the right direction, because we need to make sure that this type of work is valued, because it is one of the most foundational things that we do in this field. So this hierarchy of knowledge manifests itself in other ways. And many times, if people don't involve those that they consider to be the subjects of their studies, they can do more harm than good in this work of fairness. So for instance, there are entire computer science communities working on fairness and giving lots of examples of, incarcerated people or people with this issue or that issue when they have never spoken to an incarcerated person, when they have never sought the advice or sought the knowledge of those people, because those types of lived experiences are not considered important in the hierarchy of knowledge that I'm talking about. And that can be extremely detrimental when you are sort of publishing papers, citing a specific community, but you're not really engaging them or valuing their knowledge, and really in real life you're getting famous and having papers and whatever, getting tenure when their suffering is basically being used by this community. So another thing that people talk about is parachute science, where this happens a lot in international development, for instance, where a lot of people in the West are like doing research or whatever in Africa or like various African countries, but they have never engaged the local communities there, or assume that local communities don't have enough knowledge to do that kind of work. And in Silicon Valley, this manifests itself in many ways. So one thing we're seeing now is that 5 years ago, nobody really talked about ethics very much. People weren't really taken seriously. I remember trying to have this conversation and people really not getting it at all. Now, 2020, 2021, and now we're at a place where everybody's talking about it. But they're not really, and they are having an understanding that there should be some sort of process, there should be some sort of ethics course, there should be AI principles or whatever. But again, if you are going to, who is participating in this process and who has the power to do what, makes a big difference. So for instance, if I write a paper about large language models and the risks and harms, and apparently there are AI principles or processes, but people who are not from marginalized communities are at the top of these processes can just shut down this work, that does a lot more harm than good. I mean, I think it's just better not to have these processes if you're gonna do that kind of thing. So again, in my talk, I was asked by Pietro, what about curiosity-based research? So this is what I was doing a talk at Caltech. The same issues apply. Whose curiosity-based research is funded, whose voice is amplified, and this imbalance can be harmful. So going back to gender recognition, where I said, someone's view has actually obviously seeped into this API, someone's view about the world and what gender is. It's not just perpetuating a particular view, it also harms many communities. So for instance, Morgan Klaus has done a lot of work here, and others. And so here are some papers that talk about, for instance, this gender reductionism has social implications, and especially harms people in the trans community, but not only people in the trans community. So I guess my conclusion, what I wanted to bring across is that the assumption that people's position in society does not affect their research, whatever kind of research we're talking about, is really not true. And that assumption causes a lot of harm. And so this hierarchy of knowledge is a result of power structures. And so in my opinion, it really is one of the foundations of issues of fairness, accountability, transparency, ethics, justice, whatever you want to call it in AI. And it really isn't just an industry versus academia issue. So many times when people were talking about my firing, they're like, oh, you should go to academia, you'd have more academic freedom there. No, in my opinion, academia has this indentured servitude type of structure where people at the top, this hierarchy of knowledge is still huge. People at the top have a lot of freedom, perhaps, but they can do whatever they want to people at the bottom. So just most recently, Khadija Johnson, a colleague and a friend of mine, was fired from Cornell Tech by a tenured professor just like that. And so, and there was issues with the hierarchy of power and knowledge there too. So I think at the root, we need to change how these disciplines are taught, and we need to change what is valued in our conferences. So for instance, this new data track at NeurIPS, I think, is a good step in that direction. And it affects all forms of research and all aspects of the knowledge production process. So in that realm, I wanted to talk about like what books I had when I was an undergrad, and like when I was doing my master's and stuff, it was all about electronics and whatever and VLSI, etc. And these are the books I was missing, right? And that I'm trying to read up on now. So Ru has Race After Technology, Simone Brown's Dark Matters, that talks about the connection between surveillance and tech in the US throughout history. Sorting Things Out, which is a fundamental book on taxonomy and categorization in the world and how it affects society. Black Software by Charlton McLean. Algorithms of Oppression by Ruha Benjamin, by Sophia Noble, etc., etc. So these are the books that I wish I had read before, that these are the topics I wish I had been taught before now, so I'm trying to catch up. I think that's it. And so if anybody has questions, I'm here for questions.
Thank you again, Timnit. I see we have a many questions coming up. Let's start with Brandon Booth. Mara, could you give Brandon Booth the ability to unmute himself?
Second.
Okay, Brandon.
I think, Brandon, is it the, what are your questions, what you wrote on chat? I can answer the questions you wrote on chat.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, I'll answer some of the questions. Okay, so, oh man, okay, so, okay. How to address, to start addressing the inequity in knowledge hierarchy. So for instance, so I think there's a lot of just changes that need to be made. It's very difficult to ask individuals to do the right thing without having the right incentives and without having the right institutional change. So for instance, if I say, hey, PhD students need to spend a lot of time gathering and annotating data sets and be very careful and think about the ethical considerations, et cetera, et cetera. And then they do that and they spend all their time doing that, and then they can't get a job, they can't publish anything, they can't, they're getting punished for it. It's very difficult to tell people to do that. So then that means we should have a mechanism for that work to be valued. So I think one good step I'm seeing is the data track at NeurIPS. There's also supposed to be a database journal, I think, that Neil Lawrence and somebody else is working on. Those kinds of things are, I think, a good step in the right direction. We just had, I was involved in the FACT conference creation. I had a small part in it, but the fact that conference exists and that we can publish this kind of work. So that's what I mean. We need to change we need to change those kinds of practices. And I don't really think it's just because it's citable. So the question is, the algorithmic ones, is it because the contributions are citable? I don't really think it's just because that they're citable. It's just that, it's hard to, like, if you've ever written a data set paper, it's really hard to publish it even. Like conferences would just be like, people would be like, oh, but it's just a data set. What was the whatever? What's novelty? There's specific things that are considered more important than others that I think we should undo. H-index, I just don't like it. So actually, Rachel Thomas once again has this blog post about metrics and our over reliance on them. I think H-index is horrible because it is telling you that you should write a lot of papers. For instance, I cannot write many papers. I just don't. I don't care if that means I won't have a high H-index or whatever. I just can't do it because I can't put that much attention on each paper. So like if I have 100 students and I write 100, I don't understand these metrics. So I think that we need to kind of slow down and how they say move that fast and break things. We need to do the opposite of that, but we need to have an institutional practices and incentives to slow down and to encourage everybody to slow down. Yes, so I do think definitely some of these metrics would start to fade because I don't think you'd be able to write. I think it's so hard. It takes so much time to create data sets and to slowly document them and think through processes, involve different community members, et cetera, et cetera. That means, so now you have to think between doing that, between creating visualizations for your last paper, between thinking about how to maximize the impact of your last paper versus writing your next conference paper. That's the choices you have to make right now. And the right now, the incentives are you have to work on your new conference, like whatever publication, right? And so I think we really need to change that incentive. Yeah, I think that's sort of, that's, I can say a lot more there, but that's my answer for now.
Thank you, Timnit. I think next up would be Katie Felkner.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was really amazing. I have a lot of questions for you, but the first one I'd like to ask is like, I found this idea you mentioned at the very beginning of the talk about a social science boot camp for CS people to be really interesting. And I'm curious, like, if you had all the funding, all the time in the world to put that together, what would that look like? What would it cover? What do you think people should learn?
Oh God, I don't know, because I'm not a social scientist, so I think it would be an insult to social scientists for me to answer that question. But actually, what I want to do is I'd want to say, if Ruha Benjamin or Safia Noble were to reimagine the tech ecosystem, what would it look like? If Safia was to reimagine a search engine, like the parameters of what a search engine should be, like what would it look like? So I'd want to hear from those people. I would want to have people engage with their community somehow. And actually, my colleague Lynn Champy and I are working on uh, a research institute called Black Air, and that's some of the things we're thinking about. We want it to be interdisciplinary from the ground up, and we want to have incentive structures that encourage some of this stuff from the ground up. But yeah, like, what I'd want to do if I had that, 1 week boot camp or whatever, is I would assemble all of these tech critics from who are engaged in critical work from many different disciplines, whether it's anthropology, or race and gender studies, history, like Mar Hicks. I would really like to understand labor movements and how the current like time that we're in, the tech company, how could be put into context. She always talks about car companies and how they were, for instance, resisting like regulation on making their cars more safe, and how companies were union busting, and Bell, AT&T and Bell Labs, stuff like that. I would just want all of those different scholars to be teaching at this boot camp. But the problem is, right now, is like, oh, there's this hierarchy of knowledge, like I said, power. CS has a lot of power. These other disciplines don't, and so we don't have to listen to them. There's nothing that forces us to listen to anything uh, people in other disciplines say, because we have a lot. This discipline has a lot of power right now. So I think any kind of conversation about that also needs to have, like, how do we elevate some of these other disciplines so that they have more power over us, actually, so we have to listen to what they say.
Thank you again for that. I think next up would be Sarah Matthews.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, so I snuck in here as a high school social studies and humanities teacher. Really appreciated, especially these points about hierarchy of knowledge and the things that people take for granted and value, because we're seeing these discussions happen in secondary education as well. So my question is, what role do you see education at the lower levels having? What are the kinds of things that you feel that at like high school or middle school levels, students should be learning about what is important, what is worth knowing, what is the relationship between social studies and science, and learning about, the roles of diversity in science and so forth. So thank you so much.
So the two things I feel like I didn't learn in my earlier education is, even when we teach things like history, how different points of view really, really matter. I just don't recall learning that. It was just a history book written, this happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. I think that, like, the fact that different points of view, different methodologies change how history is told is a very important fundamental thing that we should learn. And the reason this is important is actually I was going to write a follow-up paper with Unso Jo, who wanted to talk about the primary analysis of primary sources in history and how that relates to machine learning. So in all of these, I think it's very important, to introduce what I think they call standpoint theory, how your standpoint of whoever is writing what really affects how it's told. And that's not only true for history, that's also true for math, or I mean, maybe you can say to a lesser extent, but what I really want is this kind of education to show us how different people's point of view affect the outcome. So if it's an experiment, a scientific experiment, what you think is important might affect like how, what is the most important thing to research. Or if it's math, like different number systems might affect different things. I don't know, but like that's really what I would have liked to learn about in my course of my education.
Thank you again. Ryan Bogutz.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I'm currently a second semester senior, about to graduate with my bachelor's degree in computer science. And during the course of my studies, I've become increasingly wary of the implications of computing in my degree on marginalized groups. And I would really like to make a career out of studying or researching ethical AI. And I wanted to know if you have any advice on how to go about this, and if there's any particular groups or companies that I should look out for.
I would look at groups like the AI Now Institute, Data and Society. There might be more that I'm blanking on, but those are some that come to mind. If you're thinking about going to graduate school, there are places like, Berkeley has like the Algorithmic, what is it? AFOG. I don't know what it stands for. Oh, Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group. I would look into information sciences departments. They like many times blend many of these things. In terms of companies, well, I had an ethical AI group at Google. And so we were, hiring an interdisciplinary group, and a lot of different companies right now are starting to have some of these groups, but it's a big question of what they will let you do once you're inside the company. So at the same time, it's very important for everybody to work on legislation and other types of things like whistleblower protection, etc., so that when people like you go into companies, they can actually do their work, right? That was the issue for me. And besides that, I think so there's a group called No Tech for Tyrants, and they had this Google Recruit Me Not campaign for students. And they understand that, like, if you're telling people to say no to some of these big companies, then you also have to give them options. So on Twitter, they had this thread where they're like adding on to different new opportunities that they can see where in tech for the public interest.
Great, thank you. Speaking of policy suggestions, I actually have a question myself, which is, as you might recall, a few days ago, NeurIPS recently required authors to include a statement of potential broader impacts to their submitted papers, quote, including its ethical aspect and future societal consequences. Authors should should take care to discuss both positive and negative outcomes. And to me, this seems piecemeal, as anyone could selectively mention minor ethical questions and how they could address them, rather than tackle deep questions about their methodology. What do you recommend to address AI ethics in the future? For example, should there be benchmark ways to ensure the methods are sufficiently fair before publication?
Well, so I do think the NeurIPS thing is a step in the right direction, because it's like you can't go from zero, it's like, I don't know, when you talk about progress, I mean, maybe people have different opinions about this, but like, kids learn how to crawl, then walk, then, you practice how to run, you go to a marathon. So I think we went from zero to people, now we're just asking them to consider, right? Like, just think about it. So some people were like, I'm a theoretical person, like whatever. How can I talk about SGD or what, Whereas, and so actually my colleague, Mahdi, who like I said, we hired before, talks about in his dissertation, etc., just how like even choices of normalization factors or norms like L1 versus L2 or something, those are deeply societal factors and have deep connections to some choices that you're making. And so some disciplines, like for instance, I think health, I've seen papers like this in health inequity or something like that, where very simple things like even measuring subtraction versus absolute value or whatever, like they talk about how these they give examples of how these affect what kind of values you're injecting to each of these decisions. Whereas a lot of people just think there's no like they're like, what, they even mocked us, I think, oh whatever, like, oh yeah sure, like optimization like this has societal values. So it's just trying to nudge people in a particular direction to allow them to see that there is value encoded in all of these decisions that you're making. And in fact, like a lot of times when people were coming up with some of these algorithms, they had some societal values in mind. So like Mahdi talks about this, actually, like the word algorithm, right? And a book, one of the first books on algorithms, how it was talking about justice, etc. Anyways, so I do think it's in the right direction. And so your second question about benchmarks. Benchmarks can be useful in some way, but just like metrics, being too dependent on benchmarks is, in my opinion, not a good thing. So benchmarks can be useful in certain things. Like for instance, you can encourage people to benchmark their energy usage, or they have tools now. A number of groups have come up with tools to help people estimate their energy usage, and so that can be benchmarked perhaps, so they can see these things. But you can maybe give out a certain number of metrics about your algorithm, whatever. But that's why I'm supposed to give a talk, and I call it Beyond Fairness. That just like what you said about the ethical statements being piecemeal, these other kind of notions are also piecemeal. And so there's no such thing as a fair algorithm. It's just like in a particular context, this might be better than this other one, this might be more harmful than this other one, etc. And a lot of times you have to see the whole picture, right? So I talked about, first, one good example of that is automatic gender recognition. Well, after we wrote our paper, a lot of some companies came out and said, oh, we fixed it now, like the error rates are not as high now. But actually they missed the point that even just having this API is harmful, whether or not the error rates are there's disparity or not. Face surveillance is harmful whether or not it works perfectly well for darker skin faces versus lighter skin faces. So if you just depend on benchmarks, etc., people might also miss the larger picture.
Thank you. With that, let's go to the next question, which is from Armin Bazarjani.
Hey, so first, forgive me, this is an ill-posed question. I'm trying to figure out how to, I guess, properly word it. But so I was first introduced to the dangers of, I guess, bias through the drama of Stalgan, and how it upsampled photos of people of color to, I guess, white people.
That was my drama too. Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I read the Twitter threads. So I think it is a very important thing for researchers to think about, as I don't think the burden should be placed on, engineers and practitioners, as a lot of people just take these pre-trained models and kind of use them without a second thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my question is, how are we to recognize these types of bias without like having a standardized, I guess, way to quantify it? So for example, you see something and it appears biased, and are we supposed to, I guess, iterate through different versions, or
Well, yeah.
basically like, yeah.
So I think like that's what I was trying to say in my prior answer, is that it depends on the context. So there's some context for which the most important thing is to make sure that, you know, the error rates are the disparity in error rates is as low as possible, and that's maybe the thing you should worry about the most. It's not always like, so for instance, if we talk about melanoma detection or something like that, a lot of people talk, there's a Twitter account called Brown Skin Matters that's handled by some people, and I think there's even an article about it, how dermatologists learn to identify disease in lighter skinned and not really darker skin. So a lot of people, when they go to the doctor, they can't get diagnosed appropriately because they haven't learned how to do this appropriately. So in this case, the most important thing to do could be to quote unquote diversify your data set and try to have metrics. There are a lot of metrics for fairness. There are over 30 proposed metrics, and each of them come with certain assumptions. In our the website I mentioned here, here, for instance, we talk about different metrics derived from social choice theory, and how when you choose one or the other, like how things change. So you can't escape from making some sort of decision based on the context. There's no universal, you know, this is fair, this is not fair. It just really depends on the context. So that's why domain expertise is really important, and understanding this context is really important. So that's why we call this field a socio-technical field. So actually a good paper on this is called Fairness, is it in abstraction or and abstraction? So I'm going to try to find the link. And so they talk about here that technical fixes fairness and abstraction in socio-technical systems. And this is a very important paper because they talk about how technical fixes without understanding the larger context can actually do more harm. So that's the nerve that Jan LeCun touched when he was talking about that was one of those things. And this comes a lot from disciplinary traditions. Like when you hear people like, you know, Ruha or Safia talk about it, they don't talk about it like this. They care very much about the framing and they look at the larger picture. When you see Tawana Petty, for instance, and her interview at Logic magazine where she talks about face surveillance, she's talking about the larger picture. She's not reducing it to, oh yeah, like, you know, you need to make sure that the that the face surveillance system works equally well for Black people versus white people, right? And so it could be a very reductionist approach. So so again, what I want to say is that there's a lot of metrics. I mean, just metrics up the wazoo. There is even I think a tutorial by Arvind in 2019 or 2018 called 27 fairness metrics and their politics, something like that. 27 fairness metrics in their politics, because there are so many metrics you can use. It's just that, you know, there are implicit assumptions and you need to still think about them and understand them. And so what I recommend actually is that still, I mean, like usually for me, it's harder for me to know what's fair, but it's easier for me to understand what's unfair and identify what's unfair. So I like to think in terms of unfairness, but I still think that when things are in used for high stakes scenarios, like, you know, like for instance, like melanoma detection, like I said, like healthcare, there needs to be, I mean, I don't disagree with you that there needs to be a process for auditing. So Kathy O'Neill has an auditing company now, and I highly respect her because, you know, she wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction, and she has a very nuanced understanding of many of these issues. I think the government can play a role. It can require companies to do an audit and to maybe make it public. There could be an FDA type body that does these kinds of audits. And so then we need to understand the process by which the audits are done. So there's something we call procedural fairness, where we're focused on the process. So we don't know what the outcome will be, but we're very focused on what we think the right process is to arrive at, you know, the answer of whether something should be released or not, or whether something is too harmful, or how much, you know, disparity is okay or whatever.
Thank
And
you.
I wrote a paper on this actually with Deb. So it's the paper about the process, like I told you, is called let me just find it, Closing the AI Accountability Gap. So I'm gonna just paste it here.
Great, thank you. Next up would be Emilia Ferreira.
Hi, Timnit. Thank you so much for giving us a chance to listen to your work. I personally think that your activism is maybe the best thing that happened to the AI community in a very long time. So my question, absolutely, my question is about really building a better academic environment where responsible AI research can be carried out with the right incentives. And, I am one of those people, in some sense within the ivory tower, as a tenured professor and whatnot, but I'm one of those who wants to help and who wants to change the status quo, etc. But, sometimes it's hard for all the reasons that you were mentioning before. There are some kind of like perverted systems of incentives, etc. So and sometimes you have colleagues who don't necessarily agree with their mission. The reason I'm asking, and I hope to get some of your thoughts on that, is because I think that at the end of the day, corporations and academia are institutions built by people, made by people, right? So it is pretty obvious, even just looking at what happened to you and all the examples that you brought during your discussion, that maybe the previous generation has failed in some sense into bringing awareness as part of the education and academic experience of the folks who are now in charge in the leadership positions and so on, right? And I think we shouldn't do the same disservice to the next generation, right? If we want things to change, we need to change the people who then end up leading these corporations and so on, right? So what are your thoughts about building better academic environments for students, faculty and whatnot, to carry out responsible AI research?
So as you said, I think that people are really important. So some mistakes that people make is assuming that they care as much about a certain topic, so it doesn't matter. So like in the feedback I heard about our paper that we wrote, the first thing they said was like, oh, this paper talks about many of the things that many of us care about, many of us think about, right? But like really, the amount of thought you give something is directly proportional to how harmful it is to you, and how, if I have to wake up every day and I can't even go to work, I'll think about the issues that are preventing me from doing that much more than anybody else, regardless of how much anyone cares. So the people, so folk, yeah, it is built by people, and I think that making sure that you open the doors for certain groups of people who will then bring this to the forefront is most important. And so actually that's what examples I wanted to give, right? In my work, that's one of the things I think is super important too. So for instance, Joy Buolamwini was at MIT, MIT Media Lab, and she really didn't have anybody to work with so when we published her, work, it was like, I was a PhD. I mean, when we were working on it, I was a PhD student. She was a master's student. It was just the two of us. And because we found each other, and I was, making sure that her work would be visible, and her approach, and basically just valuing everything that she brought to the table. Whereas with many other people, she was facing a lot of resistance. People were trying to devalue her work. They were trying to discourage her from even continuing in computer science, because they had an idea of who should be a computer scientist or not. So when you see someone like that, it's very important to make sure that they're supported, and make sure that their voice is heard. So so the same thing with Deb. That was an example with Deb. I have other examples, like I'm working with someone, for instance, I'm working with a number of people from South Africa, and like one of the students that we're working with is Raseja, and she was raised in a township, and we're working on a project on analyzing spatial apartheid using like satellite images. For me, I could not imagine doing this work without people in South Africa. I don't understand how people do this kind of thing, because it just, that knowledge that she brings is crucial to this work. And for me, her career trajectory and how, like, whether or not she's successful based on this work is as important to me as the paper itself or the work itself. So like, I see those as inseparable, right? And I don't see it as, oh, we got to work on fairness, and so it doesn't matter who works on it. Like, I think it's as important whose voice is heard and whose voice is uplifted in this process, because the approaches we use are different. So that's one thing I would say. And another thing I would say is that there's like breaking down institutional barriers. So, a lot of times, like, bringing in someone to a hostile environment is not useful, because they'll just be it becomes abusive. They'll just be basically abused and leave, or they can't do anything, right? So it's really important to first bring in a leader. So if you're that leader, right, it's so important. I've seen it like in my work at Google. Sammy, if Sammy wasn't there, like, he was really shielding us from a lot of stuff, and they couldn't even let him do that at the end. But he was a very, famous and very, like, a powerful person, and so he was using his power to shield our work and make our voices heard. His voice was not really, like, he wasn't writing papers on ethics or whatever, but he was making sure that our voices were being he was shielding us. He was making sure that our voices were being heard. And we had to work on changing the process to hire social scientists as research scientists. So he was supportive of that, and he helped us with that. So breaking down some of these institutional barriers is important. So like in Black in AI, for instance, we have this academic program that Reddit, Abeba, my co-founder, runs. And like, they came up with some of the barriers that that Black people face. So for instance, at Berkeley, they removed the GRE requirement this year, and they've accepted a record number of PhD students in computer science for the first time. Black PhD students, I mean. Now, if you just brought one Black PhD student to this environment, they still wouldn't succeed. So if you have a cohort and you make sure that the environment is supportive of them and you're with them every step of the way, then then you're more likely, I think, to make a change. But I do think focusing on individuals is important, because they're the ones who make up the the people who are leaders, etc. And finally, what I would say is that also there's like this sometimes this tokenism and this checking boxes. So people might believe that because of some activism or some work that others have done, they might say, oh, we need to have Black people, we need to have women, we don't have women, and then they just kind of go get a woman. And and it's like it's not really that different from having, I don't know, that kind of attitude can be actually harmful, in my opinion. The box checking thing, what you want to do is make sure that you bring, you value certain types of contributions, you value certain types of work, and that will bring the groups of people that I think you're at this point kind of excluding. And of course, like, working on institutional practices is super important. Like I was saying, I've been involved in creating new conferences, creating new tracks, or creating, it's just, you can't ask people to change or do something without also working on the institutional practices. So I think it's important to think about how you can work on those. And I think your students are always ahead of the institutions. What I've seen from academic institutions is that the students are so ahead, and they're like super frustrated because the professors are not, or they're trying to do their own thing. Like, they're trying to create their own reading groups, they create their own classes, and they don't have support. And they're struggling. And I think giving support to those groups of people is really important, making sure that they can do those things.
Thank you so much.
And I know there are people who've been holding their hands up for a while, so thank you for your patience. The next person in line would be Brandon Tren.
Hello.
Hi.
So I had a question about what you think these big tech companies will do after you got fired and the resulting fallout. Because I think we can both agree that these big tech companies can't be left to manage themselves. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
What I was trying to do was to affect some amount of change while working at these companies, and I had no illusions about where I was working. But I was like trying to say, okay, trying to think about, okay, where are their incentives and how can I, incentivize them to do X, Y, and Z, that kind of thing. But I had no illusion that if your incentive is to maximize profit, that is going to be what you do at any cost, right? If you just have no other incentive, that's just what you're going to do. And so this assumption that that they're going to self-regulate is just not going to work. And at the same time, I think it's important for people who do the kind of work I was doing there to still be able to do that kind of work. I don't think the answer is for everybody to just have a mass exodus and for there to only be public institutions or third-party institutions doing this. I do think it's still important. I mean, I might change my mind at some point, but right now, I do think it's still important to do that kind of work. And so what does it mean for people to be able to do that kind of work? So just recently, a shareholder has suggested a resolution to strengthen whistleblower protections. I don't think they'll vote for it. A Google shareholder did that. I think that's good. And I think a lot of people are pushing for better whistleblower protection, legislation wise. Ifioma, Ozoma, and Erica Banks are working on the Silence No More Act to make sure that women who face hostile workplaces can still talk about it even if they signed an NDA, etc. in California, I believe. So those are the kinds of things I think are important. Antitrust laws I think are important. When someone has too much power, they'll just use that power. Like they don't. And it can be that there can be dumb, like Claire Simpleton, who was one of the Google walkout organizers, wrote an article that's called "Power is Dumb," and so she was talking about, and it can be true, but they just have power, and so they can do dumb things. They don't have to be malicious, even they can just do things that are wrong, but they have the power to do it. So it's really important to curb that power, or like have another entity or whatever for people to be able to have some amount of power to counteract it. And so in conclusion, I really don't think they'll do anything on their own, but I do think that there are things that can be done from the outside to even protect the people who might want to do things inside. So for instance, on the Google walkout page, there were a number of things that were asked, like a number of calls for action. One of them is for academic institutions to rethink their relationship with Google, like in terms of sponsorship. So some academics took personal costs and they refused Google sponsorship, but it's not sustainable for everybody to do that. So if we're asking everybody to do this, then we need other sources of funding for academics, right? That's what I mean by counteracting the power. We asked for conferences to look at publication procedures, because if the papers that are coming into your conference now have to be censored by, they were like edited by lawyers and told them to take out like actual information that is important to put out there, especially like when we're talking about the ethical considerations at NERPS, right? It's telling authors to write ethical considerations, but then if your lawyers are like, no, don't write about this bad thing for society, that should be taken into account. So those are the kinds of things we're asking. But I think at the end of the day, it's about shifting power, right? So if I'm asking an academic to not take sponsorship from Google, what's their alternative? What's their incentive to do that? If you're telling people not to work at big tech companies, what is their alternative to, what is their incentive to do that? What alternatives are we working on? So I think that's the kind of stuff we should work on. And then once we have the power, they have to listen. They'll be forced to listen to us, right? They didn't listen to me because they didn't have to, but at least once the press started, they saw the visibility, they still didn't really have to. Then like legislators wrote them paper, they wrote like a letter, and they wrote like some whatever letter back. They still didn't feel like they had to listen to that much, but now I think they know people are watching. But that needs to that pressure needs to be kept up until something real happens. I think like some real change happens.
Thank you again. Shikar Singh.
So firstly, I mean, I appreciate your sort of view on like encouraging
sort of scientific and ethical and societal consciousness within the scientific community. And my question would be that, say you have this notion of gatekeepers, and then you have the individuals. So how do you attribute, whom do you attribute the cause? Is it, so for example, you brought up the example of war and defense and electronics advancements. So is like expressing anti-war view going to affect your grant from DARPA? So is it sort of like that kind of a power structure, or is it just the lack of absence of that sort of consciousness that, okay, I don't care what happens in the Middle East, and like as an individual, why do I care? And I just have to go. So
Yeah.
how do you understand the attribution of this sort of structure?
You know who made a really good point here? Ruha Benjamin, when she gave a talk at iClear. She talked a little bit about this, and she cited some book. I think that's why I bought the book Design Justice. Oh, no, not Design Justice. Let me just see in my let me just look at my or is it Ruined by Design? Maybe it's their book Ruined by Design. Because the reason I bought this book was someone asked a similar question to Ruha about institutional change. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the individual? What can the individual do, or whatever? And she recommended this book Ruined by Design that talks about how people as individuals can institute change, right? So in terms of what your question about anti-war views, or whose responsibility is it, generally speaking, I think it's a system that's created and individuals are part of the system, and so then you have to try to change the system. And as an individual, you have to understand, I think, that your role in the system. But I have found that many times individuals don't understand the agency that they have. Like when they're working at corporations or when they're universities or whatever, I think that like individuals don't understand the amount of change they can affect and the amount of agency that they have, like that they can say no to certain things. And so I think that the first point is awareness. Like I think people need to be aware of how the institutions they're in are changing things. So once there is awareness, then there could be collective movements. And I think that any individual, it should probably be acting in collective movement. So right now, graduate students are starting to unionize. I think that's a really good first step. They're starting to form collective movements. And the reason these collective movements are important is because they give people power. And it's really difficult to get anything done without power, because institutions don't just change like because they're nice people or of their own volition. It's usually some shift in power happens and they have to listen to the other group that has power now that didn't have it before. So I guess, that's what I would say is that, it's like a lot of times people think that as an individual, they can't do anything because it's too daunting. It's too overwhelming to be in this big, thing that's happening. And what can you do as an individual? But there are, ways to act if you know that you have agency, to build collective movements and to build collective power so that that entity can act accordingly rather than use an individual. And this book, I think this book Ruined by Design, I think is what talks about that. I haven't read it yet, but that Ruha recommended about people's individual responsibilities within institutions and how they can affect change.
It's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Dhruval Trivedi. Oh, and before Dhruval speaks, I know we've been going for an hour and a half, so if you need to leave soon, Timnit, please feel free to tell us.
Yeah, I think, okay, so what I'll do is I will answer this question from Nina as well on the chat. And maybe I see that there's 3 people who raised their hand, and maybe after that, I'll just stop after we answer those questions.
That's fine. So you wanted to speak, you wanted to hear, oh wait, someone's lowered their hand. Okay, so maybe we can start with the person in the chat.
So Nina said, I'm from Brazil and I work with fairness here and there. Thank you for sharing your opinions and work. Here, Brazil's creating a culture similar to what I mentioned from Stanford and startups. I am from a computer science and my final project is precisely linked to racial algorithmic injustice and facial recognition. We are facing some problems of using recognition in the area of public security. How do you envision the future with the lack of transparency of these uses in society? Brazil seems to be following in the footsteps of the USA in some implementations. Yeah, I mean, so then we also have companies like Clearview that are out there right now. And you know, when I started working on this in like 2016 or so, I couldn't envision any sort of change. And then now there's been a lot of change already. Like, so in the US, there's been some laws that have been passed, like in different cities, banning the use of face surveillance by law enforcement. There are reports like written by, for instance, people at Georgetown Law, called the Perpetual Lineup is one. Another one is America Under Watch. And they talk about the extensive uses of face surveillance and how, and uses and misuses of face surveillance. So I think these kinds of reports help inform people, in addition to our work on showing the disparities in error rates, help inform people on how in the different ways in which people's rights are being infringed upon uh, with these technologies. And so it's way beyond make the disparities in error rates. Like even if it works perfectly well on everyone, or like, or it doesn't work perfectly well on everyone, is still problematic. And so I'm seeing a lot of change, but I don't know. I haven't seen. I think there's a national bill also under discussion right now. I don't know where that is. I'm not keeping track of where that discussion is. But I'm hoping that at least that type. And in Europe they have much, I think, better privacy laws. So I'm hoping that I don't know where it's going, but I'm hoping that's the direction that we're going to be going in.
Thank you. Dhruval, since you had your hand up for the longest, we'll let you speak first.
Thank you so much. And firstly, ma'am, thank you so much for your talk. It was great. Like, it was very inspiring. Secondly, I actually have watched the Coded Bias documentary as well. So what are my thoughts from the talk and the documentary are that the model itself, it's not necessary that only the model is biased. There are chances that the data set is also biased, which can be either intentional or unintentional. Those biases can be unintentional. So the problem that Joy faced in the beginning was an unintentional problem against race and gender discrimination because of the data set. She also didn't predict that this would be the scenario in future. My question is that for public data sets, there are companies, there are huge giants that are marketing their products. They are trying to influence consumers, users, trying to attract them towards their product, their services. And for that, they are using these types of biases intentionally. We actually had a discussion on this in one of my lecture with my professor. So we thought that, okay, this is a point that what can we do about those intentional biases that are added by ourselves? Okay, we know that research is going on for unintentional biases, that people are trying to resolve those problems. People are trying to come up with new methodologies that what can be done to make the models less biased, make the data set less biased. But what of these intentional biases?
You mean
What is
like
your stand
targeted
on that?
advertising? Like, so for instance, they want to identify someone's face, race or gender from their face so that they can do targeted advertising towards them?
Kind of, yes. And in another manner, I just wanted to say that, okay, the public data sets that are created by these advertising or these marketing agencies, like for example, if we search for a job role, then it is possible that for marketing those job positions, they are deliberatively putting male or white
Yeah.
skin people.
Yeah, I
So
understand what you're
these
saying.
intentional biases, yes, ma'am.
So first of all, there is at least in the US, there's legislation already against this, right? So for instance, Facebook got in trouble with the HUD, the housing and I don't know what the rest is.
Housing and Urban Development, I believe.
Right, agency, yeah. For discriminating against people by protected characteristics. in their in advertising certain things like housing. So there are laws. So every single law that we have doesn't have to be about AI in order for it to guard against some of these things that we're talking about. So in some cases, there are laws that are being broken by some of these models or or APIs. And even when they're not specifically using race or gender or something else, there are proxies that they use that are creating lots of issues. So I mean, this is I think like stuff that people are still working on a number of occasions. So for instance, there was just an article a while back about healthcare, right? And how they assumed they had this assumption about the insurance rates or like how much people can pay and somehow correlation with race, and they ended up like harming Black people. And like the protected characteristics in the US are different from like other places, but like there's always groups that are marginalized versus not, etc. in all like countries, right? It just depends on what that dimension is. So I think it just depends on the context, right? So you have to address it based on the context. Like Zainab also talks about how she gives examples of how, for instance, Facebook again can have, she gives an example of like targeted advertisement and how it could unintentionally, I mean, I guess you talk about intentional versus unintentional, but in this case, I don't know how to separate it, because for instance, like they talk about how you can target someone. Let's say you're having targeted advertising for like Las Vegas or gambling or something like that, and then maybe you find the gambling addict and you're now giving them all of these advertisements. You're targeting them. It's harmful, right? You weren't trying to find, you didn't explicitly said I want to find a gambling addict and give them gambling advertisements, which is harmful, but you did, using their like other data and proxies, you did find that person, and now you're doing this kind of advertisement. There's so much stuff I can give examples of here. So it depends. The solution, I think, depends on the context. Like in gender, for instance, like some people talk about how why people use gender recognition. Sometimes they use gender as a proxy for something, and they want to advertise something. So for instance, like people want to use, want to say, oh, we're gonna like look at your face and say you're a woman versus a man, and that's usually the dichotomy that they use, and we're gonna advertise certain kinds of things so that we can advertise certain kinds of things to you versus somebody else. And that's harmful in a certain way. Like sometimes it could perpetuate gender stereotypes, first of all, and other times there's probably other proxies you can use rather than this kind of binary gender dichotomy. Maybe you're looking for someone who likes makeup, and you can use other characteristics to know whether they want to see an advertisement about makeup or so. And so Morgan Klaus actually gives a lot of examples about this, of how you can use many times when you're looking for gender, you're actually looking for other characteristics and not gender. And so you can use those other characteristics. In terms of, the targeted advertising type examples I saw, I suggest following like Zainab Turfuchi's work, and she talks a lot about alternatives and like ways of holding these companies accountable. I don't think it's simple as like, oh, do this to your model or that. I think there's like a holistic sort of approach that's necessary, and she has some examples of those things.
Great, thank you, Timnit. We will have Haoming Lee talk, and then Katie, and then we'll stop for your sake. So Haoming Lee, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just put my question in the chat, but let me elaborate on that. You mentioned the word power a lot, and I like that, assuming you're meaning it in the Foucauldian sense. So I want to ask you about your position on, a lot of the scholarship on power, are largely pessimistic, as you may aware, as in we're just doomed. It's just capitalism after all. So I want to have I want to, but from your talk, I hear a lot of optimism. I think you firmly believe that these problems at some point can be addressed. So I want to know your position on the two, perhaps the two idea that relates to power.
I see. So this is one paper by my colleague Redit Abebe that talks about power, and it's in this space, specifically in algorithmic fairness and decision making, um, with some math sprinkled in. She said she wanted to write her views, but she thought she had to put in some math to make people read the paper. Well, so you hear a lot of optimism because there is no other choice for me. I just can't believe we're just doomed. I mean, it's just very difficult to live life in that way. So for instance, right now, there is a war happening. I left because of a war in Ethiopia. There is another war that's happening. There is, that is horrible, like the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. And so I have to believe that that will change. And I don't know, like I honestly don't know like a lot of the scholarship on power that you're talking about from econ. I know more, like what I know most from econ is social choice theory, which I use for some of diversity and inclusion work. But I'm not aware. I don't know like much of the work that you're that you're discussing. So I don't know. Like, I don't know how I'm using the term power in that context, versus like some other, academic discipline. But Ruha Benjamin quoted Miriam Makamba, who's like a prison, anti-prison activist, a prison abolitionist, and she said, "Hope is a discipline." It's like something you have to work on every day. So imagine like people in prison who are uh, didn't commit the crime there for life, whatever, like how do they have hope? So she talks about hope being a discipline. So that's what I think. I don't believe, and I believe a lot of Afrofuturists, for instance, and so Ruha also talks about reimagining technology in her book. I believe we can reimagine technology. I think it's just, as people, sometimes we lack imagination, and so we think that things are set, and they're just how they are, and we can't change them. And I think we have to believe that we can change things, and there are different ways of living. Like, I don't think this unfettered capitalism that we're living in is the only mode of living. So we have to change it. Like, if we are talking about institutions, for instance, when I talk about whistleblower protection, one of the first things people talk about is how they'll lose their health insurance if they do anything, they get fired. Number one thing to think about is health insurance. Well, we have to change that. We have to have health insurance, and that's kind of goes into, universal health care. So going back to my point of view about how all of these things are interrelated, I don't think we can separate the political system from like the tech industry and what's happening here. But yeah, so I feel like, I hope that it's changeable, because many of these ways of being we've seen before in other societies, and we've seen things in the past. It might sound radical to talk about it right now, but it's like other societies have lived in other ways, right? So when we talk about gender, other societies have had non-binary gender forever. They've had third genders forever. For some reason, like it reversed back, and now we're trying to bring back that idea, right? It's not really that radical, even though we feel like it might be. So that's sort of my point of view. And sometimes people say optimism is delusional, like it's not real. And that's, you're optimistic because you have to survive. And that's possible, right? I think people say when people are depressed, that's the most accurate they are about the state of the world many times. But then you're paralyzed and you can't live, right? So in a way, it might be a combination of delusion and just having to survive, and maybe some reality somewhere there. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. One final question from Katie.
Hi, thank you so much for humoring me and taking a second question. As I'm getting more into the scholarship on fair AI, I noticed that a lot of the work that's out there is pretty much just about binary gender and then race in terms of the US Census checkboxes. And you had a really great point in the Stochastic Parrots paper about how, a list of quote unquote obscene words can erase queer people because those are the words we use to talk about our identities. So I'm wondering how you think researchers should push the diversity conversation forward outside of just, race and binary sex to, be more fully inclusive of queerness, of disability, of socioeconomic status, of, ethnic background, refugee status, all of those things that are equally important.
Yeah, I think it's that concept of intersectionality, right? And everybody always leaves someone behind. So for instance, when people like I have a group, we started a group, Black in AI, and there's queer in AI. After Black in AI, so we thought about how to name Black in AI. First, we were like, should we call it represented groups in AI or something more general like that? And we're like, no, because I was like, I want to address a specific need of a specific group that's always left behind. And then we find Black women are also like extremely under, like even within Black, whatever the conversation of race, Black women at the bottom. And then when you take other intersectional, groups like disabled Black women, so Black trans women, like all of those combinations. But I think that we have to have a very, specific approach. That's why for me, I didn't believe that. So what I was happy about was that once we started Black in AI, there's Latinx in AI, queer in AI, disabilities in AI, and then there was women in machine learning that was predated many of these things. But we created all these other organizations because we didn't think, like for instance, I didn't think women in machine learning addressed any of the needs of Black women, right, at all. So if you don't look into it, I think that you are at a risk of addressing the issues for the most privileged in that group without looking at, like everybody else. So, and Haben Girma, who's a deafblind Black woman, human rights activist, she's on our board of directors, advisory board of directors at Black in AI. So she talks about how like she went to a diversity and inclusion event at BU, I think, Boston University, and it didn't have captions. She couldn't even attend it because, it didn't have live captions or anything like that. And so it's extremely disheartening, she was saying, when it's something specifically for diversity and inclusion, and it kind of reminded her that they weren't thinking about her. So I don't really, so I think, so our approach, my thinking has been like this. It's been that I try to think of, the most, let me say, it's categorization is always going to leave out someone, but there are some things already about groups that are extremely marginalized. So we know about people in the disability community, queer community, but then with queerness, there's not just sexual orientation, but gender. And so you can have a queer community that's not inclusive of gender queer people, even in their language and in many other things. And I've seen that too. Within the Black and AI community, there's a lot more stuff than that too. There's geographical diversity, and people in different geographies have different issues. And so we try to pay attention to that. We definitely paid attention to the socioeconomic status from day one, because one of the things we did was that we knew that, for instance, like a lot of these other organizations, the first, like Women in Machine Learning, for instance, if they gave you a grant, you would first have to pay for it on your own, and then you'd get a reimbursement from them. Like that would just eliminate a lot of people for us, because a lot of people they can't pay that. We knew that, so we had a different mechanism for where we paid for everything upfront, etc. So it's just, but now, like, another thing that happened is iClear was going to be held in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has a lot of, let's just say it's very far from being queer friendly. It has a law where it actually criminalizes homosexuality. So a lot of people then you could see the split between the African queer people and the queer people from North America, etc. A lot of people were saying, how could you have this conference in Ethiopia? You can't have it, blah, blah, blah. A lot of the queer Africans were saying, this is ridiculous. You should keep the conference in Ethiopia. You know, you don't think about the issues we face when we're trying to come to your, you know. So this friction happened, and Queer in AI and Black in AI was like working together to have a guideline. We decided we still want the conference to be in Ethiopia because we at first was informed by the queer Africans that, you know, who are the ones dealing with all of this for, you know, day in and day out. And then it was great because there was a discussion about it with queer people from all over the world in Queer in AI. So people were able to be educated, and the queer African activists were talking about why they found it offensive when other people were saying, you know, just to be at a conference for 4 days, they were saying no. And because that kind of removed opportunities from the queer people in Africa because they can't come to Canada because of visa issues. You know, so it's a multiple, you forget that like there are multiple dimensions of oppression. So it's not like they, you know, that's the only thing they're thinking about. So that to say for me, like I don't have like a strategy besides realizing that all of these dimensions that we're talking about apply to most people. Most people are not just one thing or the other. They're all of those things at the same time. And it's important to have organizations that address all of these different things, but then we can work together. So we worked with, you know, Queer in AI. The Disability in AI would have, you know, for instance, guidelines on how to, you know, have inclusive events for people with disability, etc. And so we actually at Black in AI, we had remote presence before these conferences would even have remote presence. But all of this is additional work. But the problem is when you don't feel like your constituents are majority of that specific group, you won't do that additional work. That's why, you know, for instance, a certain group would always be left behind. So it's a work in progress, but that's how I approach it. And I think it's, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw's like work on intersectionality is super important here to realize that, you know, it's very important to look at those multiple identities. And I also think that that's why checking boxes is really harmful sometimes, because you can check boxes without actually doing the right thing for even that community that you're checking boxes for. So in fact, you could benefit from the work of all of these other people in your community doing stuff when you're not doing, and you know, and so sometimes a lot of people don't want the loud ones from this community, but because of the loud noise from this community, they realize they need to have somebody from this community in there. So they'll pick like the least, you know, like effective person or whatever, and they check boxes and they hire them, right? And I think that's also like harmful. So, you know, yeah, I don't know, like, so that's sort of how I approach some of these things, right? It's that we all have to be cognizant of all of the dimensions of marginalization. And even when people immigrate here, right, from different groups of people from different countries, you know, they bring like, you know, the people who have the opportunities to immigrate here are usually the people who are most privileged in that whatever country. And that's also something to think about, right? So for instance, there were Indian women who had an open letter in Silicon Valley about caste discrimination. They were talking about that, but a lot of people might not even think about it. So yeah, so I just think that's just, I don't really have like a step 1, step 2, step 3 thing, but I think I try to sort of keep my eye out to learn from different communities and try to incorporate that in our work.
Thank you again, Timnit. With that, I want to say this has been an incredible talk, and I thank you again for taking the time out of your day to talk here. I also want to mention for those interested that sort of inspired by Timnit's work, R. Thomas McCoy from JHU will be talking next week, where he'll be discussing creating language models with less data and with improved generalization. Hopefully that will, to some small degree, improve upon that stochastic pairs idea.
Cool.
So thank you again. I think this talk's over. We can stop the